Welcome, dear listener, to a delightful cozy mystery in the classic tradition of Agatha Christie. Settle in with a cup of tea as we return to the charming village of St. Mary Mead, where nothing is ever quite as simple as it seems. In Miss Marple and the Watchmaker's Secret, our sharp-witted elderly sleuth, Miss Jane Marple, unravels a puzzle involving time itself. Relax and enjoy this tale of village intrigue, clever clues, and comforting resolution. Chapter 1. The stopped clock in the quiet English village of St. Mary Mead, where thatched cottages leaned companionably together along winding lanes and the spire of St. Mary's Church rose serenely above the elm trees. Life proceeded with the gentle rhythm of long custom. It was the early 1950s, a time when the scars of war had begun to fade, ration books were at last consigned to drawers, and the villagers once again took pleasure in small, familiar comforts. The scent of fresh bread from the bakery, the gleam of polished brass on cottage doors, and the dependable chime of the church clock marking the hours. At the center of the high street stood a narrow shop with bow windows and a discreet sign that read E. Hawthorne, Watchmaker and Clock Repairer, in faded gold lettering. For more than 40 years, Elias Hawthorne had occupied those premises, a precise, solitary figure in his 70s, invariably dressed in a dark suit and a spotless white shirt. His silver hair was neatly parted, his spectacles gleamed, and his long, delicate fingers seemed made for the intricate mechanisms he tended. Villagers brought him grandfather clocks that had sulkily refused to strike, pocket watches that had suffered falls or immersion in streams, and delicate wristwatches whose hearts beat too fast or too slow. Mr. Hawthorne accepted every commission with the same grave courtesy, and he returned every piece in perfect order. "Time waits for no man," he would say with a faint smile, "but a good watchmaker can persuade it to behave." Miss Jane Marple lived only a few doors away, in a neat Georgian house surrounded by a garden where roses and lavender flourished in orderly profusion. To the casual eye, she was simply a pleasant, elderly lady with fluffy white hair, bright blue eyes behind spectacles, and a fondness for knitting and gentle gossip. She attended church regularly, served on the flower rota, and was always ready with a kind word or a jar of homemade blackberry jam. Yet beneath this unassuming exterior lay a mind as sharp and observant as any detective's. Miss Marple had long ago discovered that human nature, in all its variety and frailty, revealed itself most clearly in the quiet routines of village life. A hesitation in a greeting, a glance too quickly averted, a tone just slightly too bright. These were the threads she patiently followed until the pattern became clear. On a crisp autumn morning, when the air carried the faint smoke of bonfires and the leaves of the horse-chestnut trees glowed amber in the sunlight, the village awoke to an unusual silence. The church clock, which Mr. Hawthorne wound and regulated every week with ceremonial care, failed to strike 9. By 9:30, the omission had been noticed. By 10 o'clock, it had become a topic of urgent conversation outside the post office. Mrs. Archer, the postmistress, declared that something must be seriously amiss, for Mr. Hawthorne had never in all his years allowed the clock to fall even a minute behind. It was young Tommy Pierce, the newspaper boy, who made the discovery. He arrived at the watchmaker's shop as usual, pushed open the door, which was unlocked, though the sign still read closed, and called out cheerfully. Receiving no answer, he ventured further into the dim interior, past the crowded display cases and the workbench littered with tiny wheels and springs. There, slumped forward in his high wooden chair, was Mr. Hawthorne. His head rested on the leather-topped bench amid a scatter of watch parts. One hand still loosely held a delicate screwdriver. Tommy needed only a moment to realize that the old man was beyond help. With a frightened yelp, he dropped his remaining newspapers and ran to fetch Constable Perkins. By midday, the news had spread through every cottage and farmhouse. Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple's old friend from Gossington Hall, telephoned in a state of great agitation. "Jane, my dear, it's too dreadful. Old Mr. Hawthorne is dead, found this morning in his shop. And the strangest thing, every single clock in the place has stopped. Dozens of them. Mantel clocks, carriage clocks, pocket watches, all frozen at exactly 17 minutes past 3. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "All stopped, Dolly, at the same moment?" "Exactly the same, according to Tommy. He says it gave him quite a turn, seeing them all staring blankly like that. The police are there now, and your nephew Dermot has been sent for from Scotland Yard." Miss Marple murmured something soothing and replaced the receiver. She sat for a moment in thoughtful silence, then rose, fetched her coat and hat, and set out along the high street. The shop door stood open. A small knot of villagers lingered at a respectful distance while Constable Perkins kept guard. Inside, Inspector Dermot Craddock, a tall, pleasant-faced young man with a deceptively casual manner, was conferring with the police surgeon. Miss Marple, known to both men and welcomed by her nephew as a helpful amateur with an uncanny knack for seeing what others missed, was permitted to enter. The air inside the shop carried its familiar faint scent of oil and metal, but today it felt heavy, unnatural. On every shelf and surface the clocks stood silent. A handsome ormolu mantel clock, a sturdy kitchen timepiece with Roman numerals, a row of silver pocket watches on green bays, all had stopped at 3:17. The great-grandfather clock in the corner, which had ticked solemnly for a century, pointed, accusingly, to the same hour and minute. Miss Marple moved slowly about the room, her gaze keen behind her spectacles. Mr. Hawthorne's body had been removed, but the chair remained pushed back from the bench, the scattered tools untouched. A cocoa cup, half empty and cold, stood beside a small spirit lamp, evidence, the doctor had already suggested, that the old man had taken his usual bedtime drink before retiring to the rooms above the shop. Inspector Craddock joined her. "Poison, almost certainly," he said quietly. "Arsenic, we think, though we'll wait for the analysis. No sign of a struggle. Door locked from inside, back window latched. Whoever did this was admitted willingly, probably someone he knew and trusted." Miss Marple nodded. "And the clocks? All stopped deliberately?" "It seems so. Everyone that could be reached. A deliberate act, and a curious one." She paused before the display window where a single modern wristwatch, slim, chromium-plated with a black leather strap, continued to tick softly, its hands moving steadily toward the correct time. "This one did not stop," she observed. Craddock frowned. "Odd. Perhaps the killer overlooked it." "Or perhaps," Miss Marple said softly, "it was meant to keep going. One must consider why some things are done and why others are not." Outside, the church clock at last struck the hour, tardily set right by the sexton. Inside the silent shop, Miss Marple stood among the motionless timepieces and felt the familiar stir of curiosity. Secrets, she reflected, were rather like old clocks. They might appear to have stopped forever, yet with patience and the right touch they could be coaxed into revealing what they had hidden all along. Chapter 2. The suspects emerge. The afternoon following the discovery brought a steady drizzle that softened the outlines of St. Mary Mead and kept most villagers indoors. Curtains twitched, telephones rang, and the tragedy was dissected over countless cups of tea. By evening, 4 names had risen to the surface of conversation, each attached to a motive as neatly as a label on one of Mr. Hawthorne's repair envelopes. First among them was Reginald Blake, the old watchmaker's assistant. A tall, dark-haired young man of 25, Reginald had worked in the shop for nearly 8 years. He was skilled with his hands and quick to learn, but the village had long ago decided that he lacked application. He spent his evenings at the Blue Boar talking of London and the bright lights he intended one day to enjoy, and he was often late on Monday mornings. Mr. Hawthorne, though fond of the boy in his stern way, had frequently rebuked him for carelessness. Only a fortnight earlier, the two had been heard arguing behind the shop door. Reginald's voice raised in frustration, the older man's clipped and cold. Now, with the reading of the will by Mr. Polk, the solicitor, it became known that Hawthorne had left the entire business, stock, tools, and a modest but comfortable sum to Reginald. "He was like a son to me," the will declared. The village wondered whether Reginald had known of his good fortune in advance, and whether gratitude or impatience had proved the stronger emotion. Next came Miss Lydia Green, the schoolmistress who lived in the small cottage adjoining the watchmaker's shop. A spare, precise woman in her late 50s with iron-gray hair drawn into a bun and a manner that could silence a classroom with a single lift of the eyebrow. Lydia had been a regular visitor to the shop. She brought in the school clock for regulation, the hall clock for cleaning, and more often than villagers quite understood, her own silver pocket watch, an heirloom from her father. Tongues had wagged gently for years about a possible understanding between the two solitary souls, but nothing had ever come of it. Recently, however, there had been a coolness. Lydia had complained to Mrs. Price at the dairy that Mr. Hawthorne had become quite impossible over the matter of a shared hedge that divided their gardens. She had been seen clipping the offending twigs with unnecessary vigor. Some now recalled that Lydia kept weed killer in her shed, an arsenic-based preparation no different from the rat poison found in the shop's storeroom. Captain Harold Wentworth, retired from the merchant navy and resident in the red brick house opposite the church, provided a third and more colorful possibility. A large, florid man with a nautical beard and a voice that carried across the village green. The captain had inherited from his father an elaborate marine chronometer, brass-bound and magnificent. For years he had brought it to Hawthorne for servicing, and for years the bills had mounted. The captain was not a rich man. His pension was small and his fondness for whiskey and the occasional flutter on horses considerable. Only last month he had been heard in the Blue Boar declaring that skinflint Hawthorne will bleed me dry if I let him. The chronometer, it was whispered, was now the captain's only asset of real value. Had Hawthorne pressed for payment one time too many? Last and perhaps most intriguingly, there was Mrs. Evelyn Swettenham, who arrived from London the very afternoon of the death. A handsome woman in her 40s, elegantly dressed and quick with a bright social laugh. Evelyn was Hawthorne's niece by marriage. Her late husband had been a cousin of the watchmaker. She visited St. Mary Mead infrequently, usually when funds were low or when London society grew temporarily dull. Hawthorne had never approved of her. He considered her extravagant and flighty. Yet blood was blood, and he had occasionally lent her small sums. Lately, however, letters had passed between them of a sharper tone. Evelyn had been heard telling a friend on the London train that her uncle was an interfering old busybody who ought to mind his own affairs. The village wondered what affairs those might be. Miss Marple heard all these fragments of information as she went about her gentle errands the following day. She purchased wool at the draper's, collected a library book, and paused to admire the chrysanthemums in the churchyard. At each stop a few words were exchanged, a confidence offered, a speculation shared. By tea-time she had a clear picture of the four principal figures and their possible reasons for wishing Elias Hawthorne out of the way. That evening Inspector Craddock called at her cottage, rain dripping from his hat. "I've interviewed them all, Aunt Jane," he said, accepting a cup of tea and a slice of seed cake. "None of them has what you'd call a proper alibi. Reginald Blake says he left the shop at 6 and spent the evening at home reading. No one saw him after that. Miss Green marks exercise books in her sitting room, alone, of course. Captain Wentworth claims he was in the Blue Boar until closing time, but the landlord says he left early, complaining of a headache. And Mrs. Swettenham arrived on the 7:15 train this evening, but she admits to having been in the village yesterday afternoon on what she calls private business. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And the stopped clocks, Dermot? Have you discovered anything more about them? We've examined everyone. All were stopped manually. Hands moved to 3:17 and the mechanisms halted. It must have taken 20 minutes at least. Whoever did it was remarkably thorough except for that one wristwatch in the window. The modern one, Miss Marple murmured. The one that goes on ticking. Exactly. It belongs to Captain Wentworth. He collected it the day before yesterday. Perhaps the killer was disturbed, or perhaps it was simply overlooked in the gloom. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Or perhaps it was left ticking on purpose. One does not stop every clock in a watchmaker's shop without a reason. It is a gesture, almost a signature. Craddock smiled ruefully. You're thinking of a motive beyond the obvious ones, aren't you? I am thinking, said Miss Marple, that in villages everyone knows everyone else's business, yet somehow the most important things remain hidden until something like a death forces them into the light. 4 people with reasons to wish Mr. Hawthorne gone. But only one of them, I suspect, felt the need to stop time itself. Outside, the rain pattered softly on the window panes, and the church clock, newly regulated, struck 7 with solemn precision. Inside the warm sitting room, Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, her mind turning over the possibilities as steadily as the needles clicked in her hands. Chapter 3. Initial Clues and Village Whispers. The days following Mr. Hawthorne's death settled into a pattern familiar to St. Mary Mead whenever something out of the ordinary occurred. A heightened awareness of every footstep on the lane, a sharper interest in neighbors' comings and goings, and a steady stream of quiet conversation wherever 2 or 3 villagers gathered. Inspector Craddock and his men worked methodically. The half-empty cocoa cup from the workbench had been sent for analysis. The results confirmed arsenic in sufficient quantity to kill. The remainder of an old tin of rat poison kept in the storeroom beneath the stairs for occasional use against mice was found to be missing a considerable portion. The back door had been locked and bolted from the inside. The front door had been locked but not bolted, suggesting that Mr. Hawthorne had admitted a visitor and then secured the premises after the visitor left or appeared to leave. No footprints disturbed the flower bed beneath the back window, and the window itself remained firmly latched. Miss Marple, meanwhile, pursued her own gentle inquiries. She had long ago learned that the most valuable information often arrived unsolicited, wrapped in apparently idle gossip. On the morning after the inquest, a brief affair at which the coroner returned the expected verdict of murder by person or persons unknown, she paid a visit to the post office. Mrs. Archer, sorting letters with practiced speed, greeted her eagerly. Such a shocking thing, Miss Marple, poor Mr. Hawthorne. And all those clocks stopped, it fair gives you the shivers. It does indeed, Miss Marple agreed, selecting a book of stamps. I suppose everyone is talking about who might have done it. Well, naturally. Young Reginald Blake was in here yesterday posting a letter to a London jeweler. Thick envelope it was. Asking about valuations, I shouldn't wonder. He's always talked of selling up and going to the city. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And Captain Wentworth? Mrs. Archer lowered her voice. He pawned his war medal last week over in Much Benham. My sister's friend works at the shop and told her. Said he looked desperate. That chronometer of his must be worth a pretty penny, but he swore he'd never part with it. From the post office, Miss Marple proceeded to the bakery, where the scent of new bread provided a comforting counterpoint to grim conversation. Mrs. Price, weighing out a pound of biscuits, confided that Miss Green had been seen the previous evening burning papers in her back garden. A whole heap of them in an old tin bucket, smoke everywhere. Papers? Miss Marple asked mildly. Letters, I think, old ones yellow with age. She looked ever so upset. Later, walking home past the church, Miss Marple encountered the Reverend Leonard Clement, who was arranging the hymn board. A sad business, he said, shaking his head. I saw Mrs. Swetnam arriving yesterday. She went straight to the shop and stayed nearly an hour with the inspector. Came out looking quite white. Miss Marple murmured sympathy and continued on her way. By lunchtime, she had added several small pieces to the picture forming, in her mind. That afternoon, she accepted an invitation to tea with Mrs. Bantry at Gossington Hall. The two ladies sat in the comfortable drawing room overlooking the lawn, where late roses still bloomed. I can't stop thinking about those clocks, Mrs. Bantry declared, passing the cake. Why would anyone go to all that trouble? It's almost theatrical. Miss Marple helped herself to a slice of Victoria sponge. Exactly so, Dolly, it is a gesture, and gestures usually mean something, either to mislead us or to satisfy some private feeling in the person who made it. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. Do you have any idea who it might be? Not yet, but there are curiosities. That one wristwatch still ticking, for instance. It belongs to Captain Wentworth, I understand. Yes, he collected it the day before the murder. Boasted about it in the post office. Said Hawthorne had made it keep perfect time at last. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed behind her spectacles. Interesting. And Reginald Blake, did you know he has taken to wearing a new tie? Silk, quite expensive for a young man on his wages. Mrs. Bantry stared. You think he already knew about the will? I think, Miss Marple said gently, that money expected is often spent in advance. They were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Craddock, who had come to report progress. He accepted tea but refused cake. We've found traces of arsenic in Reginald Blake's lodgings, he said quietly. He uses it for stuffing birds. Says it preserves the skins. Mrs. Bantry gasped. Then he did it, Craddock smiled wryly. It's suggestive, certainly. But half the village gardens contain arsenic in one form or another. Weed killer, rat poison, insect powder. Miss Green has a tin in her shed, and Captain Wentworth bought some only last spring for his roses. And Mrs. Swetnam? Miss Marple inquired. She admits visiting the shop the afternoon before the murder. Says she wanted to borrow money and was refused. Claims she left at 5 o'clock and caught the train back to London. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Alibis are useful things, but they are not always quite what they seem. Tell me, Dermot, have you examined the stopped clocks closely? We have. Everyone was stopped by hand. The mechanisms were not damaged. The hands were simply moved to 3:17 and the pendulums or balances halted. It was done carefully, knowledgeably. By someone who understood clocks then, or who had watched Mr. Hawthorne at work for years, Craddock finished. Mrs. Bantry looked from one to the other. Then it must be Reginald. Possibly, Miss Marple said, but there is something else. Young Tommy Pierce told me he saw a light in the shop very late, long after midnight. He was out poaching rabbits, he says, and noticed it burning in the upstairs window. Craddock frowned. He didn't mention that to me. Boys who poach do not always confess everything at once, Miss Marple observed. But if there was a light, then someone was in the shop after hours. The inspector stood. I'll speak to him again. Thank you, Aunt Jane. When he had gone, Mrs. Bantry turned to her friend. You don't think it's Reginald, do you? I think, Miss Marple replied, that we are only beginning to see the shape of things. Clues are like stitches in knitting. One sees the pattern only when several have been placed. At present we have a few stitches, but not yet enough to tell whether we are making a sock or a jumper. Outside, the autumn sun sank behind the trees, casting long shadows across the lawn. In the village, the church clock struck 5, its note clear and steady now that it had been properly attended to. Miss Marple finished her tea and prepared to walk home, her mind busy with the small, seemingly trivial details that so often, in the end, proved to be the most important of all. Chapter 4. False Trails. As the week wore on, the investigation seemed to gather momentum, yet somehow the path grew more tangled rather than clearer. Inspector Craddock's men combed the village with polite persistence, asking questions that had already been asked and receiving answers that varied only in small, apparently insignificant details. St. Mary Mead, accustomed to minding its own business while simultaneously knowing everyone else's, responded with a mixture of cooperation and cautious reserve. On Wednesday morning, a discovery was made that appeared at first glance to settle the matter. In Reginald Blake's lodgings above the garage where he kept his motorcycle, the police found a small glass jar containing a white powder. Reginald, confronted, admitted freely that it was arsenic. "For my taxidermy," he explained, flushing. "I stuff birds sometimes, owls, a fox once. Arsenic soap preserves the skins. Mr. Hawthorne knew all about it. He even showed me how to mix it properly." The quantity missing from the shop's tin matched roughly what might have been taken, but proof of transfer was lacking. Reginald was taken to the police station for further questioning and released again by evening, protesting his innocence with a vehemence that convinced some and alarmed others. Miss Marple heard the news from the grocer's boy who delivered it along with her weekly order. She thanked him calmly, unpacked her groceries, and then sat down with her shopping list to think. Arsenic was not rare. Every garden shed contained something similar. Yet the discovery had undoubtedly tightened suspicion around the young man who stood to gain most from his employer's death. Later that day, she walked to the high street and paused outside the watchmaker's shop. The blinds were drawn, the door sealed with an official notice, but through the gap in the window she could still see the silent ranks of clocks. On impulse, she crossed to the cottage next door and knocked gently. Miss Green opened the door almost at once, as though she had been waiting. Her face was pale, the bun of iron-gray hair a little less severe than usual. "Miss Marple, how kind. Do come in." The sitting room was orderly to the point of austerity. Books neatly aligned, a single vase of chrysanthemums on the table, exercise books stacked ready for marking. Tea was offered and accepted. "I suppose everyone is talking about poor Mr. Hawthorne," Miss Green began, pouring with a steady hand. "Such a dreadful thing. And now they are saying it was Reginald." Miss Marple accepted her cup. "People always say things, my dear. It is wiser to wait until one knows." Miss Green set down the teapot. "I blame myself in a way. We quarreled, you see, about that silly hedge. I said things I regret, and now, well, people remember quarrels. Quarrels are soon forgotten when there is no real harm behind them," Miss Marple said comfortably. "Though I did wonder, those papers you were burning the other evening. Old letters, I believe someone mentioned." Miss Green's hand trembled slightly. "Yes, letters from years ago. From my father, mostly. Private things. When one lives alone, one sometimes feels the need to clear away the past." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically and changed the subject to the school's forthcoming harvest festival. When she left 20 minutes later, she carried away the impression that Miss Green was hiding something, but that it was unlikely to be murder. That same afternoon, Captain Wentworth provided fresh excitement. The marine chronometer, retrieved from his house for examination, proved to have an interesting history. Engraved on the back plate was a set of initials that did not match any known member of the captain's family, and a London expert consulted by telephone suggested that the instrument had once belonged to a ship lost under suspicious circumstances during the war. Insurance fraud was hinted at. The captain, summoned to explain, blustered loudly. Absolute nonsense. My father bought it fair and square. Hawthorne knew that perfectly well. He serviced it for years. But he may have discovered something recently, Craddock suggested mildly. The captain's face grew redder. If he did, he never said a word to me, and I'd have paid him eventually. Man's entitled to his fees. Miss Marple learned of this development from Mrs. Bantry, who telephoned in a state of high indignation on the captain's behalf. It's too bad, Jane. Harold Wentworth may be a fool with money, but he's no poisoner. And as for that chronometer, half the things brought back from sea in those days had cloudy histories. Quite so, Miss Marple agreed. But discoveries, even of old secrets, can sometimes be dangerous. Thursday brought yet another twist. An anonymous letter arrived at the police station, written in block capitals on cheap notepaper. The captain did it for the chronometer. Look in his garden shed. The shed was searched and yielded nothing more incriminating than a rusty lawnmower and several empty whiskey bottles. The letter was dismissed as village mischief, but it added to the general atmosphere of suspicion. By Friday, Inspector Craddock was beginning to look tired. He called on Miss Marple in the evening, accepting sherry rather than tea. We seem to be collecting motives and opportunities in equal measure, he confessed. Reginald had means and motive. Miss Green had opportunity and a quarrel. The captain had debt, and now this questionable chronometer. Mrs. Swetnam has admitted borrowing money repeatedly and being refused the last time. Any one of them could have done it. And the stopped clocks, Miss Marple asked. Still a puzzle. Whoever stopped them knew exactly how to do it without damage, quickly and cleanly. That points to someone familiar with the shop, or someone who had watched carefully, Miss Marple said. Tell me, Dermot, has anyone examined the grandfather clock in the corner? The tall one with the moon dial? Craddock frowned. Not specially. Why? Because it stands higher than the others, and the hands are rather stiff. Stopping it would require a small stepladder, I think. Was there any sign of one being used? Craddock made a note. We'll look again tomorrow. When he had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long time by her fire. False trails, she reflected, were very much like the false casts a knitter sometimes makes when learning a complicated pattern. One pulled them out eventually, but not before they had led one astray for a while. The anonymous letter, the arsenic in Reginald's room, the dubious history of the chronometer, all might be true without being relevant. The real question remained. Why had someone taken the trouble to stop every clock in the shop at precisely 3:17, except for the one modern wristwatch that continued to tick? Outside, a wind had risen, rattling the windows and sending dry leaves skittering along the lane. The church clock struck 9, its note carrying clearly through the night. Miss Marple listened to it with quiet satisfaction. Time, at least in St. Mary Mead, was moving forward again. But somewhere in the village she felt sure someone was still trying very hard to make it stand still. Chapter 5. Deepening Shadows. By the second week of the investigation, a subtle unease had settled over St. Mary Mead like the thin autumn mist that rose each morning from the meadows. Doors were locked a little earlier. Footsteps on the lane were listened for with extra care, and even the most innocent errands seemed to carry an undertone of watchfulness. The shop with its drawn blinds remained sealed, a silent reminder that something remained unresolved. Reginald Blake provided the village with its most dramatic moment yet. On Saturday evening, pale and agitated, he appeared at the railway station with a small suitcase, evidently intending to catch the last train to London. The station master, Mr. Stringer, who had known the boy since childhood, detained him long enough for Constable Perkins to arrive. Reginald was brought back to the police station, where he spent an uncomfortable night protesting that he had simply intended a short visit to town. to get away from all the talk. Inspector Craddock released him the next morning with a warning, but the incident hardened opinion against him. "Running away, that's as good as a confession," declared Mrs. Price at the bakery, and many nodded agreement. Miss Marple, returning from church on Sunday, paused to speak to old Mrs. Hinchcliffe in her garden. "Poor lad looked proper frightened," Mrs. Hinchcliffe said, leaning on her spade. "Mind you, if he didn't do it, who did? That arsenic in his room doesn't look good." "Appearances can be misleading," Miss Marple replied mildly, "though I confess I find his behavior puzzling. A guilty man might run, but an innocent one usually stays to clear his name." That afternoon she took a gentle stroll past the watchmaker's shop and noticed that the police seal on the door had been broken. Inside, she knew Inspector Craddock was conducting another thorough search. On impulse, she continued to the cottage next door and found Miss Green in her front garden, deadheading the last roses. "You are looking tired, my dear," Miss Marple observed. Miss Green straightened, pressing a hand to her back. "I have not been sleeping well. All this upset, it brings things to the surface one would rather forget." Miss Marple waited sympathetically. "It is foolish, perhaps," Miss Green continued, "but years ago I borrowed something from Mr. Hawthorne's shop without asking. A tiny watch spring I needed for a demonstration at school. I meant to replace it but forgot, and then it seemed too late to confess. Now with everything that has happened, I keep imagining someone will find out and think the worst." "A small thing, long ago," Miss Marple said gently. "I am sure it weighs on no one's mind but your own." Miss Green's eyes filled with sudden tears. "You are kind, but secrets have a way of growing larger in the dark." Miss Marple pressed her hand and moved on, reflecting that while the schoolmistress's confession explained her recent nervousness, it hardly amounted to a motive for murder. Monday brought a fresh development. The police surgeon's full report confirmed that death had occurred between midnight and 4 in the morning, most likely closer to 3. This narrowed the field considerably, for it meant the poison had been administered during a late visit, after the shop was officially closed. Mrs. Swetnam's visit the previous afternoon was therefore irrelevant to the actual crime, though her refusal of money still provided motive. Captain Wentworth's movements after leaving the Blue Boar early remained vague. He claimed to have walked home alone. Miss Green's light had been seen burning late by a neighbor. Reginald, living some distance away, could have returned unnoticed on his motorcycle. Inspector Craddock called on Miss Marple that evening, looking harassed. "We've found something else in the shop," he said, accepting a cup of cocoa. "A hidden drawer in the workbench. Hawthorne must have had it built specially. Inside was a bundle of papers, an old will from Mrs. Swetnam's late husband, leaving everything to a charity, and notes in Hawthorne's handwriting suggesting the signature had been forged. If he'd been about to expose her." Miss Marple nodded. A serious matter, but would she have known he had discovered it? She admits he hinted at family irregularities in his last letter to her. She came down the day before to try to persuade him to keep silent. And failed. "Exactly," Craddock sighed. "So now we have Reginald with means, motive, and opportunity. Miss Green with opportunity and a guilty conscience over a trifle. Captain Wentworth with debts and a questionable chronometer. And Mrs. Swetnam with a secret worth killing to protect. And still those stopped clocks staring at us." Miss Marple set down her knitting. "Have you considered the time they all show, Dermot? 3:17. It is very precise. Either it marks the exact moment of death, or it is meant to suggest something quite different." Craddock looked at her sharply. "You think the clocks were stopped to create a false impression of when death occurred?" "It is possible. If the doctor's estimate is correct, death was in the early hours. But suppose someone wished us to believe it happened earlier or later. though with modern toxicology so precise that would be risky. Unless, Craddock said slowly, the killer did not know how precise the estimate would be. They sat in silence for a moment. There is one other small thing, Miss Marple added. The wristwatch that did not stop. It is quartz regulated, I believe. No, wait, in the 1950s such things were only beginning. No, it is a modern lever escapement watch, but with a particularly stiff setting mechanism. Captain Wentworth complained to me once that it was difficult to adjust. Perhaps the killer tried and failed to stop it. Craddock made a note. We'll check the mechanism tomorrow. When he had gone, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, but her mind was elsewhere. The shadows were deepening, motives multiplying, yet somehow the pattern remained elusive. She felt certain that the key lay not in the obvious secrets, the forged will, the debts, the inheritance, but in something smaller, more personal, something connected to those silent clocks and the one that had refused to be silent. Outside, the mist thickened, swallowing the lane and muffling the sound of the church clock as it struck 10. In the sealed shop, the motionless hands pointed eternally to 3:17, waiting for someone to understand what they were trying to say. Chapter 6. Twists in Time. The third week brought the first hard frost, silvering the roofs of St. Mary Mead and turning the fallen leaves to fragile lace underfoot. Breath hung in the air, and the village seemed to draw in on itself, waiting for the mystery to resolve as impatiently as it waited for spring. Inspector Craddock's patience, meanwhile, was wearing thin. The evidence pointed in too many directions at once, and none of them quite convincingly. On Tuesday morning, he summoned Captain Wentworth to the police station again, this time to examine the wristwatch that had refused to stop. The captain arrived blustering, beard bristling with indignation. Damned nuisance, all this. I've told you everything I know. Craddock placed the watch on the table between them. A slim, modern piece with a luminous dial and a black leather strap. You collected this from Mr. Hawthorne 2 days before his death. I did. Paid him handsomely for the overhaul, too. Yet when every other clock in the shop was stopped at 3:17, this one continued to run. The captain shrugged. Modern mechanism, I suppose. Stiffer crown. Harder to set by accident. Or deliberately, Craddock said quietly. We've had an expert look at it. The setting stem is indeed unusually resistant. It would take real force or the proper tool to move the hands. Captain Wentworth frowned. Meaning what exactly? Meaning that whoever stopped the other clocks may have tried and failed with this one. The captain stared, then gave a short bark of laughter. And you think that points to me? Because it's my watch? Good Lord, man, I wasn't in the shop that night. You left the Blue Boar early by your own admission. To walk home and go to bed, ask my housekeeper. She heard me come in. The housekeeper, questioned again, confirmed that she had heard the front door at 9:30 and the captain's heavy tread on the stairs. It was not conclusive, but it was something. Later that day, Miss Marple encountered the captain on the high street. He greeted her with unusual civility. This business is wearing me down, Miss Marple. They've got me in their sights now because of that blasted watch. It is curious, certainly, she agreed, but curiosities often turn out to have simple explanations. She continued to the post office, where fresh gossip awaited. Tommy Pierce, emboldened by repeated questioning, had expanded his story. He now claimed to have seen not only a light in the upstairs window after midnight, but also a figure moving about the shop downstairs, someone tall, wearing a dark coat. The description could fit Reginald, the captain, or even Mrs. Swettenham in her elegant London cloak. Miss Green, being small and slight, was less likely. That evening, Reginald Blake appeared at Miss Marple's cottage, uninvited and clearly distressed. He stood on the doorstep, twisting his cap in his hands. "May I come in for a moment, miss?" "I won't keep you long." Miss Marple led him to the sitting room and offered tea, which he refused. "They're all saying I did it," he burst out. "The arsenic trying to leave for London. Everything looks black against me, but I swear I didn't harm him. He was good to me in his way." Miss Marple regarded him calmly. "Then sit down, Mr. Blake, and tell me why you wish to leave the village so suddenly." Reginald sat, shoulders slumped. "Because I was afraid. Afraid they'd arrest me and I'd never get away. Mr. Hawthorne was strict, yes, but he taught me everything. And now he's left me the business." His voice cracked. "I didn't know about the will until it was read. I thought he'd leave it to some museum or charity." Miss Marple nodded. "And the arsenic in your room?" "For taxidermy, like I told the police. He knew about it. Used to tease me for wasting time on dead birds when I should be learning proper horology." She asked a few more gentle questions, then let him go with a mild admonition to stay and face things out. When the door closed behind him, she sat thoughtfully, comparing his manner with others she had observed under strain. On Wednesday, the police received the results of further tests. The arsenic from Reginald's jar matched exactly the type missing from the shop tin. Same manufacturer, same batch markings visible under magnification. It was strong circumstantial evidence, and Inspector Craddock felt obliged to take Reginald into custody pending further inquiries. The village heard the news with a collective intake of breath. Arrest seemed only hours away. Miss Marple spent the afternoon in her garden wrapping tender plants against the frost. As she worked, she turned over the facts again. The stopped clocks, the single ticking watch, the precise time of 3:17, the arsenic that pointed so neatly at Reginald yet was available to half the village. Something was not quite right. That evening, Mrs. Bantry telephoned in great excitement. "Jane, they're saying it's definitely Reginald. The arsenic matches, and Tommy Pierce swears he saw someone tall in the shop late at night. It's all over." Miss Marple's voice remained tranquil. "Dear Dolly, things are often most confusing just before they become clear. I think perhaps tomorrow I shall pay another visit to the shop." "But it's sealed." "Inspector Craddock will allow it, I am sure. There is something I wish to look at more closely." The following morning, with Craddock's reluctant permission, Miss Marple entered the silent shop once more. The clocks still pointed to 3:17, their faces dusty now. She moved slowly among them, peering at mechanisms, noting which had been stopped by halting the pendulum, which by moving the hands against the going train. At the grandfather clock in the corner she paused longest. Its tall case rose nearly to the ceiling. To reach the hands would indeed require the small set of steps kept behind the counter. She fetched them herself, climbed carefully, and examined the dial. The hands were heavy brass, the minute hands slightly bent where force had been applied. Fingerprints had been smudged but not entirely obliterated. Descending, she noticed something else. On the floor beneath the clock lay a single strand of dark wool caught on a splinter. She picked it up carefully and tucked it into her handbag. As she left the shop, she met Inspector Craddock outside. "Anything useful, Aunt Jane?" "Perhaps," she said. "Tell me, Dermot, have you noticed that every stopped clock shows 3:17 in the morning on a 24-hour face or in the afternoon on a 12-hour one? But the actual time of death was early morning." Craddock stared. "You mean?" "I mean that someone wished us to believe death occurred at a different hour, but they were not quite clever enough, and one small watch defeated them." She patted his arm and walked home through the frosty lanes, her mind clearer than it had been for days. The twists were beginning to straighten. The false pattern was giving way to the true one. Soon she felt sure the clocks would be allowed to tick again. Chapter 7. Crucial Discoveries. The frost lingered into the 4th week, hardening the ground and sharpening the air. But inside Miss Marple's cottage, the fire burned brightly and the atmosphere was one of quiet determination. She had reached the stage in an inquiry where scattered fragments began to settle into a recognizable shape, rather like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle when the picture suddenly emerges. On Monday morning, Inspector Craddock called early, his face grim. "I'm afraid we shall have to charge Reginald Blake this afternoon," he said, warming his hands at the fire. "The arsenic match is conclusive. His attempt to leave the village looks like flight, and Tommy Pierce's description fits him tolerably well. Unless something new turns up, the superintendent wants the case closed." Miss Marple poured coffee with a steady hand. "I think something new will turn up, Dermot. In fact, I believe it already has. May I see the papers from the hidden drawer again?" Craddock produced the bundle. There was the old will of Mrs. Swettenham's husband, leaving his estate to a sailor's charity, and several pages of Hawthorne's neat notes questioning the authenticity of the signature. But tucked beneath them was something Miss Marple had not noticed before, a single sheet in Hawthorne's handwriting headed "Personal Memorandum." She read it carefully. "It is dated only a fortnight before his death," she said. "Listen. Have today confirmed that R.B. is indeed my son, born to Eliza Jenkins in 1928. She never told me until last year, fearing I would feel bound to marry her. The boy knows nothing. I have altered my will accordingly, but intend to tell him in person before Christmas. He must be persuaded to remain in the village and carry on the business. London ambitions will only bring unhappiness." Craddock whistled softly. "Reginald, his illegitimate son. That changes everything." "It explains much," Miss Marple agreed. "The generosity of the will, the arguments overheard, Hawthorne trying to persuade, Reginald resisting. But it also gives Reginald a stronger motive than mere inheritance. If he wished to sell the business and leave for London, the revelation that he was Hawthorne's son might bind him to the village forever, through duty and public expectation. Yet he claims he knew nothing of the relationship, which may be true, but Hawthorne intended to tell him. Perhaps he did tell him on that final evening." Craddock frowned. "Then why the elaborate business with the clocks?" "That," said Miss Marple, "is what we must discover." She asked to visit the shop once more, and Craddock accompanied her. The air inside was colder now, the silence deeper. Miss Marple moved directly to the grandfather clock, fetched the steps, and climbed them again. This time she opened the small door in the case and examined the weights and pendulum with care. "Look here," she said, pointing. The pendulum was stopped by wedging a sliver of wood between the crutch and the escapement. Very neat, very knowledgeable. And see, the wood is fresh pine, quite unlike anything in the shop. Craddock examined it. From outside, perhaps, brought in deliberately. Or from someone's own workshop, Miss Marple suggested gently. She descended and turned her attention to the workbench. The scattered tools and parts had been catalogued, but she noticed something the police had not. A faint scratch on the leather inlay, as though a sharp object had been dragged across it. Nearby lay a tiny brass wheel no larger than a sixpence. "This wheel," she said, "belongs to a pocket watch movement, but it is bent. Deliberately, I think. Someone forced it." Craddock took it from her. Reginald's work, perhaps? Or someone wishing it to appear so. They were interrupted by Constable Perkins, who announced that Mrs. Swettenham had arrived at the station wishing to make a further statement. Back at the police station, Mrs. Swettenham sat composedly in the interview room, gloved hands folded in her lap. "I have decided to tell the whole truth," she began. "My husband did forge that will, or rather he altered an earlier one. Uncle Elias found out and threatened to expose me unless I repaid certain monies I had borrowed from the estate. I came down the day before he died to beg him to reconsider. He refused. But I left at 5 o'clock and took the train to London. I was at a bridge party until midnight. 6 witnesses can confirm it. Craddock noted the names. Then you did not return that night? Certainly not. I had no need. Exposure would have been embarrassing, but not fatal to my life in London. I am not a murderer, Inspector. When she had gone, Craddock turned to Miss Marple. That removes her, I think, and the captain's housekeeper has confirmed his return home by 9:30. Miss Green was marking books in full view of her neighbor's window until 11. Leaving Reginald, Craddock finished heavily. Not quite, Miss Marple said. There is still the matter of the dark wool thread I found beneath the grandfather clock. She produced it from her handbag. It was fine merino, almost black, with a faint twist. I believe, she said, this comes from the scarf Mrs. Swettenham was wearing when she visited the shop the afternoon before the murder. She left in something of a temper. Perhaps the scarf caught on the clock case as she passed. Craddock examined it. Possible. But she has an alibi for the night. For the night, yes, but the clocks were stopped after death during the early hours. No, one thing at a time. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire with her notebook. She listed the crucial discoveries. Reginald is Hawthorne's illegitimate son, a secret about to be revealed. The clocks were stopped with expert knowledge, but one resisted. The time shown, 3:17, corresponds to the estimated time of death in the early morning. A single thread of wool, possibly Mrs. Swettenham's. The bent wheel and the pine wedge, small anomalies. She underlined the third point twice. Then she closed the book and allowed herself a small nod of satisfaction. The suspects were narrowing not to one but to the truth behind the gesture of the stopped clocks. Tomorrow, she felt certain, would bring clarity. The hands of time, frozen for so long, were almost ready to move again. Chapter 8. Narrowing the hands. By Wednesday morning, the frost had given way to a thin, persistent drizzle that veiled the village in gray. The church clock struck the hours with mournful regularity, as though conscious that its fellow timepieces in the watchmaker's shop remained stubbornly silent. Inspector Craddock arrived at Miss Marple's cottage shortly after breakfast, rain dripping from his mackintosh. "I've been up half the night going over the papers again," he said, accepting coffee gratefully. "That memorandum changes everything. If Reginald knew or even suspected that Hawthorne meant to claim him publicly as a son, it would have trapped him here forever. London would have been out of the question." Miss Marple nodded. "A powerful motive, especially for a young man who has dreamed of escape for years. Yet something still troubles me." "The clocks," Craddock said at once. "Why go to all that trouble? If the poison was administered during a late visit and the killer left afterwards, why return or remain to stop every clock at the exact time of death?" "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "It is theatrical, as Dolly remarked weeks ago. A gesture. And gestures are usually made for a reason, to mislead or to express some private emotion." She rose and fetched the dark wool thread from her workbasket. "This came from beneath the grandfather clock. I showed it to Mrs. Harmon at the draper's yesterday. She recognized the shade at once. Midnight navy merino from a scarf Mrs. Swettenham bought in London last winter. Mrs. Swettenham was in the shop the afternoon before the murder. The thread must have caught then." Craddock frowned. "But her alibi for the night is solid." "For the night of the murder, yes. But the clocks were stopped after death." She paused, letting the implication settle. "You mean the killer stopped them to suggest death occurred at a different time?" "I mean," Miss Marple said gently, "that someone wished us to believe Mr. Hawthorne died during the daytime or early evening of the previous day, when several people had perfectly good alibis. but the poison takes hours to act. Death occurred in the small hours, around 3:17 as the doctor estimated. By setting all the clocks to that time, the killer hoped to confuse the issue, perhaps to suggest that Mr. Hawthorne had been dead since the afternoon, seen by no one because the shop was closed. Craddock stared. Then the gesture was misdirection, an attempt to create false alibis. Precisely. But the killer overlooked two things. First, modern toxicology is remarkably precise about time of death. Second, one small wristwatch the captain's has a setting mechanism so stiff that it could not easily be forced without the proper tool. The killer tried and failed, or perhaps did not try at all, assuming all watches behave alike. Craddock leaned forward. And the pine wedge in the grandfather clock? Brought in by the killer. Reginald's lodgings have no pine workbench, only oak. But there is a small pine shelf in the storeroom where old parts are kept. The wedge was cut from that hurriedly to stop the pendulum without leaving fingerprints on the brass. Then it is Reginald. Miss Marple hesitated. Almost, but there is one more thing. The bent brass wheel on the bench. It was forced deliberately to suggest a struggle or carelessness. Yet Mr. Hawthorne was meticulous. He would never have left a damaged part lying about. It was placed there to incriminate his assistant. Craddock looked puzzled. By whom? By the person who knew Reginald's habits best, who understood clocks well enough to stop them knowledgeably, yet not quite well enough to manage the modern wristwatch, who had access to the shop at any time. Craddock's eyes widened. Reginald himself would have known the wristwatch mechanism perfectly. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. He serviced it only days before. He would have known exactly how resistant the crown is. Yet the killer did not, or pretended not to. She folded her hands in her lap. Consider the sequence, Dermot. Reginald visits late, perhaps summoned by Hawthorne to hear the revelation of his parentage. They talk, perhaps quarrel. Reginald, in anger or desperation, slips arsenic into the cocoa Hawthorne habitually drinks before bed. He leaves, believing the door locked behind him. But then panic sets in. He returns, perhaps with his own key, perhaps through the back window he knows how to open silently, and finds Hawthorne already unconscious. To create confusion about the time of death, he stops every clock at what he believes will be accepted as the fatal moment. It is a young man's flourish, dramatic, inspired perhaps by some detective story he has read. But he overlooks the one modern watch he himself overhauled, and in haste he damages a wheel and uses an improvised wedge. Craddock sat in silence for a long moment. It fits, he said at last. All of it. The attempt to flee, the taxidermy arsenic as a blind, the matching batch because he took it from the shop 10 weeks ago for his hobby, and the personal memorandum, if Hawthorne had told him that night that he was his father and must stay in the village. Miss Marple nodded sadly. A tragedy of youth and impatience. He wanted freedom, and in a moment of folly he threw away everything. Craddock stood. I'll bring him in for questioning this afternoon. With the new interpretation of the clocks, he won't be able to explain it away. After he had gone, Miss Marple sat quietly by the window, watching the rain slide down the panes. The suspects had narrowed at last, not by eliminating others, but by understanding the meaning hidden in those silent hands all pointing to 3:17. The village would be shocked, grieved, but in time it would heal. Secrets like clocks could be mended if handled with care. Outside, the church clock struck noon, its note clear and steady. Miss Marple listened to it with quiet satisfaction. Tomorrow, she thought, the watchmaker's shop would be opened again and the clock set going. Time in St. Mary Mead would move forward once more. Chapter 9. The Revelation. The drizzle had cleared by Thursday afternoon, leaving the air washed and the village lanes gleaming. At Miss Marple's suggestion, Inspector Craddock arranged for everyone concerned to gather in the village hall at 4 o'clock. It was a spacious room with paneled walls, a small stage, and rows of wooden chairs usually reserved for whist drives and women's institute meetings. Today the chairs had been arranged in a loose semicircle, and a fire crackled in the grate to dispel the November chill. Reginald Blake arrived first, pale and tense, escorted by Constable Perkins. He sat with his hands clasped tightly between his knees, eyes fixed on the floor. Captain Wentworth came next, booming a greeting that died away when he saw the young man. Miss Green entered quietly, choosing a seat near the door as though ready for flight. Mrs. Swetnam swept in last, elegant in a fur-trimmed coat, her bright social smile faltering only slightly as she took in the assembly. Mrs. Bantry and the Reverend Clement had been invited as representatives of the village, and a few other interested parties hovered discreetly at the back. Inspector Craddock stood near the fireplace. Miss Marple sat in the front row, upright in a high-backed chair, her knitting untouched in her lap. When everyone was settled, Craddock cleared his throat. "Thank you for coming. My aunt, Miss Marple, has asked to say a few words. She believes she can explain what happened to Mr. Hawthorne." All eyes turned to the elderly lady. She rose slowly, her gaze moving gently over the faces before her. "My dears," she began in her soft, clear voice, "this has been a sad and puzzling business. A good man, precise, solitary, but kind in his own way, has been taken from us, and for weeks we have all wondered why and by whose hand. There were motives enough. Captain Wentworth owed money for repairs. Miss Green had quarreled over a hedge and carried an old, harmless secret. Mrs. Swetnam feared exposure of a family irregularity, and young Reginald here stood to inherit the business he both loved and resented. Yet motives are common in villages. Most of us have at one time or another wished someone out of the way. What matters is who acted upon the wish. The key to this puzzle has been the stopped clocks, dozens of them, all halted at precisely 3:17. At first we thought it a gesture of malice, or perhaps a signature, but it was neither. It was an attempt, clever but not quite clever enough to mislead us about the time of death. She paused, letting the words sink in. Poison of this kind acts slowly. Death occurred in the early hours of the morning around 3:17, as the doctor confirmed. But suppose someone wished us to believe Mr. Hawthorne had died much earlier, during the day or evening before, when several people had excellent alibis. By stopping every clock at the actual time of death, the killer hoped to create confusion, perhaps even to suggest that the old man had been dead since the previous afternoon and simply not discovered until morning. But two things defeated the plan. First, medical science is too precise nowadays for such tricks to succeed entirely. Second, one small wristwatch, Captain Wentworth's modern one, refused to be stopped easily. Its setting mechanism is unusually stiff. The killer tried, or perhaps assumed it would behave like the older pieces, and left it ticking. Captain Wentworth shifted in his chair. "I've wondered about that watch ever since." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And you were right to wonder, because the person who stopped the clocks knew traditional mechanisms perfectly. How to halt a pendulum, how to move hands against the train without damage. But that same person did not know, or had forgotten, the particular stubbornness of your modern watch. Who had such knowledge? Someone who had spent years in the shop, someone familiar with every tool and movement, someone who could come and go without suspicion." Her gaze rested on Reginald Blake. The young man looked up, face ashen. "You're saying, me?" "I am sorry, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "It was you." A collective intake of breath filled the room. "You visited your master late that night, perhaps summoned to hear important news. He told you, I believe, that he was your father, and that he wished you to remain in St. Mary Mead and carry on the business. You had dreamed of London, of selling everything and leaving village life behind. In a moment of anger and fear, you put arsenic into his bedtime cocoa. You left thinking the door locked behind you. But later panic overtook you. You returned, using your own key, I imagine, and found him past help. To confuse the time of death, you stopped every clock you could reach at what you believed was the fatal moment. It was dramatic, almost romantic, something out of a storybook. You even damaged a small wheel and left it on the bench to suggest carelessness. Perhaps to cast suspicion on yourself in a way that might seem too obvious. But you overlooked the wristwatch you had serviced only days before. You knew how resistant its crown was. Yet in the plan it had to appear that the killer did not know. And so the deception failed. Reginald stared at her for a long moment. Then his shoulders sagged, and he covered his face with his hands. "It's true," he said, voice muffled. "All of it. He told me that night. He was my father. Said it was time I settled down, took responsibility. I saw my whole life closing in. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to sleep, to give me time to think. I took the arsenic from the tin weeks ago for my birds. I thought a little would only make him ill. But I misjudged." He began to weep quietly. Miss Marple resumed her seat. Inspector Craddock stepped forward, his expression grave but not unkind. "Reginald Blake, I must caution you." The formal words followed, and Reginald was led away. The room remained silent for a long moment. Mrs. Swetnam was the first to speak. "Poor boy, poor foolish boy." Miss Green dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Captain Wentworth cleared his throat several times but said nothing. Mrs. Bantry leaned toward Miss Marple. "How did you know, Jane?" Miss Marple sighed. "Human nature, Dolly. A young man wanting freedom, an older one wanting continuity, and those clocks, such a theatrical touch. Only youth would think to stop time itself." Outside, the light was fading. The village hall emptied slowly, each person carrying away a share of the village's sorrow. The revelation had come, gentle in its way, yet final. The mystery was over, and St. Mary Mead could begin quietly to heal. Chapter 10. Tea and Resolution. A week after the gathering in the village hall, the watchmaker's shop stood open once more. The blinds were raised, the clocks ticked busily on shelves and in the window, and a young man from Much Benham, recommended by the Clockmakers' Guild, had been engaged to sort the stock and carry on the business until a permanent arrangement could be made. Reginald's confession had spared the village a trial. He had been taken away quietly, and though the circumstances were sad, there was a general feeling that justice had been tempered with understanding. On a bright December morning, with the promise of frost in the air and the church spire sharp against a pale blue sky, Miss Marple invited a small party to tea. Mrs. Bantry arrived first, full of questions she had patiently stored up. Miss Green came next, looking less strained than she had for weeks. Captain Wentworth followed, bearing a box of chocolates by way of thanks for having his name cleared. Even Mrs. Swetnam, down from London for the day to settle final matters with the solicitor, accepted the invitation. The sitting room was warm and fragrant with the scent of baking. A coal fire glowed in the grate, and on the table stood a silver teapot, a platter of buttered scones, dishes of blackberry jam and clotted cream, and a seed cake still warm from the oven. When everyone had been served and the first appreciative murmurs had subsided, Mrs. Bantry could contain herself no longer. "Jane, you must tell us how you saw it all so clearly. Those clocks. I still can't quite believe they were meant to confuse the time of death." Miss Marple smiled over her teacup. "It was the one clock that refused to be confused that told the tale, Dolly. The modern wristwatch. A true expert would have known its little quirk. But someone in a hurry, someone relying on general knowledge rather than specific memory might overlook it. Captain Wentworth nodded vigorously. Damned clever of you to spot that. I'd have gone on wondering about my watch forever. It was not cleverness, Miss Marple said modestly. Merely observation. In villages, one sees so much of human nature. Pride, fear, the longing for freedom. Poor Reginald wanted to escape what he saw as a narrow life. His father, though he did not know it until the end, wanted continuity, a son to follow him. Two wishes that could not coexist peacefully. Miss Green spoke quietly. I blamed myself for my silly quarrel. And that old matter of the watch spring, it seems trivial now. All our secrets seem larger in the dark, Miss Marple replied kindly. But daylight is a great healer. Mrs. Swetnam set down her cup. I confess I feared the worst when those papers came to light. But Uncle Elias's memorandum showed he had a secret of his own far greater than mine. In the end, he protected me by saying nothing. People are often better than we expect, Miss Marple observed, and worse upon occasion. The trick is to discern which is which. Mrs. Bantry helped herself to another scone. And the pine wedge and the bent wheel? Were they really meant to point suspicion at Reginald himself? In a way, yes. A young man's attempt at misdirection, too obvious in the end. Like over-egging a cake, Captain Wentworth chuckled. Well, the village owes you a debt, Miss Marple. Things could have dragged on miserably. The village solved it, really, she said. All of you with your talk and your observations, I merely put the pieces together. Tea continued comfortably, conversation turning to lighter matters. The forthcoming Christmas bazaar, the new curate's promising tenor voice, the likelihood of snow. When the plates were empty and the teapot refilled for the last time, the guests took their leave with genuine warmth. Mrs. Bantry lingered longest. You do enjoy your little triumphs, don't you, Jane? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. I enjoy seeing things set right, Dolly, and a good cup of tea afterwards. Alone again, she cleared the table, washed the cups with methodical care, and then sat by the fire with her knitting. Outside, the church clock struck 4, its note carrying clearly across the quiet village. In the watchmaker's shop, the clocks answered in a faint, cheerful chorus, ticking steadily, keeping perfect time once more. Miss Marple listened to them with quiet satisfaction. Another small drama of human nature had played itself out in St. Mary Mead, and the village had emerged, as it always did, a little wiser and no less kindly. Time, which had seemed to stand still for a little while, moved forward again, carrying everyone gently with it.